Everybody ready? The Committee on Science, Space, and Technology will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the committee at any time. Pursuant to Committee Rule 2E and House Rule 11-2H4, the chair announces that he may postpone roll call votes. Today, we meet to consider H.R. 1224, the NIST Cybersecurity Framework Assessment and Auditing Act of 2017. I recognize myself for an opening statement. In the last Congress, the Science Committee held a dozen hearings related to oversight and policy aspects of federal cybersecurity issues. The hearings included the examination of data breaches at the Office of Personnel Management, the Internal Revenue Service, and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. These hearings underscored the need for a robust approach to protect U.S. cybersecurity capabilities. 2 weeks ago, the Research and Technology Subcommittee held a hearing on this issue where experts testified on recommendations in two recent reports that involve the National Institute of Standards and Technology. The bill we consider today, H.R. 1224, the NIST Cybersecurity Framework Assessment and Auditing Act of 2017, implements key ideas and strengthens federal government cybersecurity. I thank Representative Abraham for his initiative on this legislation. H.R. 1224 ensures that NIST remains a global leader in cybersecurity knowledge, scientific standard setting, and research and analysis of federal agency cybersecurity readiness. This common-sense legislation takes advantage of NIST's unique capabilities to both develop cybersecurity standards and guidelines, which NIST does now, and go further and evaluate and assess the extent of federal agencies' compliance with them. Creating more working groups and guidelines without a determination of whether anyone is using them or using them correctly does not protect our cyber infrastructure. NIST has the experts who develop the standards and guidelines under the Federal Information Security Modernization Act, which apply to the federal government. NIST experts also developed a cybersecurity framework through collaborations between government and private sector that are accepted and used by many private organizations to address and manage their cybersecurity risk in a cost-effective way. H.R. 1224 directs NIST to promote the cybersecurity framework by providing federal agencies with guidance on how to implement it. Who better to determine if an agency is following these recognized standards than NIST? We do not make NIST an enforcement agency. The bill does not give the agency authority to exact fines, issue injunctions, or pursue further proceedings beyond assessing, auditing, and reporting. NIST assessment, audits, and the resulting reports are for federal agencies only and will not affect the private sector. We recognize NIST will need resources to accomplish this work, and we will address that in a NIST authorization bill later this year. The federal government collects personally identifiable information about every person in our country. Unfortunately, the federal government is the world capital of cyber insecurity. 2 years ago, Chinese hackers broke into OPM's computer systems and stole the personally identifiable information and sensitive background check information on approximately 26 million people, including fingerprint records of 5.6 million individuals. Chinese cyber criminals also repeatedly hacked and may still be hacking the FDIC computer network. The FDIC hacks threaten everything from large-scale manipulation of our entire financial system to looting individuals' checking, savings, and retirement accounts. At the IRS, 2016 tax fund fraud is projected to set a new record of $21 billion. An enterprising crook needs only a name, date of birth, and a Social Security number to enter made-up W-2 information, submit a fraudulent return, and receive a refund from the IRS within 30 days. Unless we take new and aggressive steps to prevent rapidly increasing cyber attacks by foreign criminals and unfriendly governments, our economy and national security are at risk. Not doing this is a vote for the status quo, which will allow continued security breaches to occur. Representative Abraham's bill serves an important purpose and expands our ability to protect Americans from cybersecurity attacks. I again thank him for his work and urge my colleagues to support H.R. 1224. That concludes my opening statement, and the gentlewoman from Texas, Eddie Bernice Johnson, the ranking member, is recognized for hers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I understand and sympathize with the chairman's desire to move cybersecurity legislation. Cybersecurity is a critical, important topic and one that invites significant press attention. We had a very good hearing before the Research and Technology Subcommittee just 2 weeks ago, during which we heard many good recommendations from widely respected experts. Some of those recommendations fell within our committee's jurisdiction and others did not. I do remember the panel unanimously praising NIST's role in cybersecurity. I also remember discussion about developing matrix for the adoption of NIST's cybersecurity framework. Witnesses also discussed requiring federal agencies to incorporate the framework into their information security programs. I can see where Mr. Abraham has attempted to incorporate some aspects of those recommendations into his legislation. However, I specifically recall GAO's recommendation that the Department of Homeland Security and not NIST carry out surveys and assessments of the adoption and effectiveness of the cybersecurity framework. NIST itself has steadfastly maintained that they are the wrong agency to do it, and not just because of limited resources. I do not remember a single witness or a single expert recommendation suggesting that OSTP should be given any role in evaluation or oversight of cybersecurity in the private sector or the federal government. Perhaps if we substitute OMB or DHS for OSTP everywhere in the bill, it would make more sense. The majority has inserted an entirely new agency into a policy matter in which they have no expertise and no business being part of. In doing so, the bill also duplicates authorities and responsibilities clearly assigned to OMB and DHS in current law. Finally, and speaking to what may be the strangest part of this bill, I do not remember any expert recommending that NIST be given the responsibility to conduct annual cybersecurity audits of other agencies. NIST is not an auditing agency. They have no such history, expertise, or capacity. They are a standards and technology agency. In addition, a single FISMA audit costs between a few $100,000 to a couple of $1 million, depending on the size and the mission of the agency. Nowhere in this bill do we provide NIST with the tens of millions of dollars of additional funding to become the cybersecurity auditing agency of the federal government. This is a massive underfunded mandate levied on an agency which is already overtasked. Moreover, current law already assigns this very responsibility to an agency inspectors general. And no expert I know has any question of quality or integrity of the IG's work. In fact, IGs know and understand their own agency's business operations and information systems infrastructure better than NIST ever will. In short, I remain thoroughly baffled by this proposal and the legislation before us today. Mr. Chairman, I've said this before, and I will say it again here. I stand ready to collaborate and cooperate with you on cybersecurity legislation and oversight. We've been able to do so in the past, including the Cybersecurity Enhancement Act of 2014. However, the bill before us today has a number of controversial new elements which were clearly not vetted with the cybersecurity community or the administration. I will not support passage today of the legislation which will undermine the very agency we are tasked with keeping our cyber infrastructure secure. I would hope that after this markup, the majority will take the time to address the concerns that have already been raised in the short time this bill has been publicly available. I thank you and yield back.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Johnson. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 1224, the NIST Cybersecurity Framework Assessment and Auditing Act of 2017, and the clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 1224, a bill to amend the National Institute of Standards and Technology Act to implement a framework, assessment, and audits for improving United States cybersecurity.
Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I'll now recognize the sponsor of the bill, Mr. Abraham, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 1224, the NIST Cybersecurity Framework Assessment and Auditing Act of 2017, is an extension of my ongoing interest over the state of our nation's cybersecurity. Hardly a month goes by without some news of cyber attack leading to the successful breach of millions of Americans' financial, health, or other personal data. During an informative research and technology subcommittee hearing 2 weeks ago, a witness reporting the U.S. Government Accountability Office, GAO, testified, and I quote, "Cyber-based intrusion and attacks on federal systems and systems supporting our nation's critical infrastructure, such as communications and financial services, are evolving and becoming more sophisticated," unquote. The GAO witness also explained that over the past several years, GAO has made about 2,500 recommendations to federal agencies to enhance their information security programs and controls. As of February 2017, about 1,000 of these recommendations had not been implemented. These are not pieces of information to be taken lightly. Last fall, this committee marked up a bill I introduced that reflected a need for accountability, responsibility, and transparency by federal agencies relative to their cybersecurity capabilities. The bill under discussion today takes the same general approach as last year's bill, which the committee approved by voice vote. H.R. 1224 also reflects recommendations from 2 recent reports that were the focus of the subcommittee hearing 2 weeks ago. And I'll give you some highlights of that bill that include amending NIST's mission to emphasize the principle that expanding cyber threats require the engineering of security from the beginning of a system's life cycle, promoting federal implementation of the NIST framework for improving critical infrastructure cybersecurity. That's the framework portion. Establishing a federal working group to develop quantifiable metrics to help federal agencies analyze and assess the effectiveness of the framework in protecting their information and information systems. Directing NIST to complete an initial assessment of the cybersecurity preparedness of federal agencies. Directing NIST to initiate individual cybersecurity audits of each agency to assess the extent to which they are meeting the information security standards developed by the Institute. And lastly, providing agencies and Congress with an audit report. The committee's jurisdiction over NIST provides it the ability to present the Institute with the flexibility to expand its functions in an effort to address the cybersecurity emergency facing our nation. It is to NIST's credit that the committee regards the Institute as part of the solution and not the problem. H.R. 1224 reflects the committee's resolve to provide federal agencies all the tools it may be able to use to help remedy the federal government's cybersecurity shortcomings. It's easy to sit back and state, with the benefit of NIST's reputation as an exemplary agency, that we should not consider changing the way the Institute operates because of what might happen or how the Institute's reputation or effectiveness might suffer. But the current state of affairs do not suggest that the best way forward is to keep taking the path of least resistance. Much of the nature of cyber attacks continue to evolve to reflect the sophistication of the cyber criminals. We in the government must also be willing to evolve to protect Americans and our government. That evolution starts with thinking outside the box instead of maintaining a business-as-usual approach. H.R. 1224 establishes the committee's mark on a very important issue. It sets the tone for future cybersecurity discussions by taking some first steps to strengthen federal cybersecurity defenses and holding the federal agencies accountable through regular cyber audits. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Abraham. We will now proceed with amendments in the order listed in the roster. The first amendment is going to be the manager's amendment, and the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1224, offered by Mr. Smith of Texas, amendment number 008.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and I'll recognize myself to explain the manager's amendment. This amendment makes some edits for consistency and clarity. The amendment adds the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, to the federal working group established and chaired by NIST, and specifies the involvement of OMB in developing and publishing the annual report based on information compiled by the federal working group. These common-sense additions will ensure the federal working group has the best representation to effectively guide federal agencies, and that its reports have the weight of the White House behind it. OMB's role under the Federal Information Security Modernization Act means the office is familiar with the agency's cybersecurity reporting requirements. These edits further improve an already good bill, and I urge my colleagues to support the amendment. Is there further discussion on the amendment? The gentlewoman from Texas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last
The
word.
gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I oppose this amendment. As I noted in my opening statement, I oppose the underlying bill. This amendment doesn't do anything to fix the underlying problems with the bill, and in one instance might actually make the bill worse. I'm happy to see that you're adding OMB to at least somewhere in some of what belongs in the bill. However, your amendment does nothing to fix the inappropriate inclusion of OSTP in the bill. While the last paragraph of the amendment will be moot if Mr. Abraham's amendment is accepted, that paragraph has implications beyond this bill, so I want to register my concerns there too. The last paragraph contains a blanket prohibition on the use of any information collected under this bill for the purposes of oversight, promulgation of regulations. While I appreciate the desire to engage with the industry openly, blanket prohibitions on the use of information seem to me to be short-sighted. The pitfalls associated with forcing the government to ignore data in a field as vitally important as our national security or cybersecurity seems too numerous to count. The majority spent much of the last Congress taking the administration to task for various cybersecurity issues. To now force the government to ignore relevant cybersecurity information seems like a mechanism to ensure the government fails in the future. That seems like a bad idea to me. I yield back.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Johnson. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? If not, the question is on agreeing to the manager's amendment. All in favor say aye. And those opposed say no.
No.
The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The next amendment on the roster is offered by the gentleman from Louisiana, Dr. Abraham, and does the gentleman wish to be recognized?
No, sir, I'm good.
I think you may have an amendment at the desk,
Okay,
and the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1224, offered by Mr. Abraham of Louisiana, amendment number 021.
Okay, with that objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment strikes the public-private working group provision and any reference to it and the accompanying report. The language was developed as a natural extension of a similar provision for a federal working group established to help federal agencies determine the effectiveness of the framework in protecting federal information systems. However, since most of the bill focuses on the committee's concern with making federal cybersecurity system more secure, I believe this provision aimed at helping private entities would be better addressed in a separate legislative vehicle. The work of this committee over the past few years and the testimony from witnesses 2 weeks ago during the Research and Technology Subcommittee hearing reinforced the need for us to focus on federal agency issues. And you heard Chairman Smith describe the committee's review of specific agencies, namely the Office of Personnel Management and the IRS and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. I urge my colleagues to support the amendment, and I yield back.
Okay. I appreciate the gentleman's amendment. I recommend it to my colleagues. And is there any further discussion on the amendment? If not, the question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by Mr. Abraham. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The next amendment on the roster is going to be offered by the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Lipinski, and he is recognized for that purpose.
Mr. Chairman, I have a revised amendment at the desk.
Okay, the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1224, offered by Mr. Lipinski of Illinois, amendment number 013.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you. Cybersecurity is a real and growing challenge for our government, businesses, and individuals. While new authorities for information sharing on cyber threats and increased investments in our network security have been put in place, we continue to see vulnerabilities get exploited, our systems or devices hacked, and cyber intrusions occur. These often lead to significant cost or security consequences. While federal agencies have been tasked to develop cybersecurity systems based on their individual agency risk assessments, little has been done to assure the effective implementation of cyber protections based on those risk determinations, or even that those risks are adequately characterized. We tend to be reminded of this any time a federal agency is the target of a major hack. So I agree there's a legitimate need to conduct regular oversight and to audit agency risk assessments in cybersecurity implementation. But I'm not convinced that NIST, or at least NIST alone, is the appropriate agency for this task for a few reasons. First, while the Institute is capable of supporting the development of a cyber framework and standards, conducting audits would be a different task. It would require a larger workforce with new skill sets and expertise in computer security, audit methodologies, and more. Other agencies, such as the GAO, are more experienced in conducting audits, while inspectors general are going to have greater understanding of their respective agencies' business models, computer networks, and services that would allow for more comprehensive audit. There are also concerns that having this develop cybersecurity frameworks for private sector entities could be perceived as oversight or regulatory approach, which could turn private parties away from working with the Institute on other technical standard setting activities. I believe that this concern has been addressed, in part at least, through Mr. Abraham's amendment. Finally, over the last few years, an array of new cyber authorities, information sharing regimes, and technical capabilities have been stood up by legislation and executive action, which appear to not be integrated into the bill we have before us. We passed the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act 14 months ago to enable threat-based cybersecurity information to be shared between private entities and the U.S. government. DHS has continued to develop its Einstein system to detect and block cyber intrusions at federal agencies and to use that threat information to better protect the rest of the government. DHS is also tasked with working alongside the private sector to protect private and public critical infrastructure, including cyber-based systems. It is also a joint lead agency with NIST in developing a better qualified cyber workforce. I think we should be cautious in adding to NIST these new cyber responsibilities without considering how we integrate them with other existing cybersecurity programs across our government. What my amendment would do is, before conducting the audits, direct the Institute to first develop a plan for how it would carry out the very broad and intensive work of cyber auditing every federal department. We should know how much manpower this will take, what it will cost, where and if such expertise exists in the federal government, at NIST or elsewhere, or if there will be a need to contract out this type of work. We also need to know what type of methods or approach NIST and or other agencies would use in conducting cyber audits. Once the Institute has developed that plan and sent it to Congress, we'll know the costs and requirements to fulfill this task and can support NIST effectively in carrying out its mission. My amendment had originally sought to delay the onset of the audits so that it would follow the plan, but I understand the Chairman's interest in the audits commencing as soon as possible. I hope we can continue to work to perfect this as the bill moves ahead. We do not want to ask NIST or any other agency to take on the vital task of assuring our federal agencies have prepared their networks to be safe, but then not provide it with the manpower, funding, expertise, or knowledge to do the job right the first time. We have seen far too many times computer network security get shorted in attention or resources, and then we complain about the outcomes. We should not do that now, and this amendment will help to hopefully ensure that we do not do that here. So I ask for support of this amendment, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lipinski. I appreciate the thoughtful amendment, and I recommend it to my colleagues. And yes, we will continue our discussions on the general subject. Or is there any further discussion on the amendment? If not, the question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by Mr. Lipinski. All in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The next amendment on the roster will be offered by the gentleman from Illinois, Dr. Foster, and he is recognized for that purpose.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment is from myself and Mr. Takano, and it simply adds...
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1224, offered by Mr. Foster of Illinois, amendment number 010.
And without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. I'm going to reserve a point of order against the amendment for being non-germane, but nevertheless, the gentleman is recognized to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment is from myself and Mr. Takano, and it simply adds a sense of Congress that the Office of Technology Assessment, or OTA, should be reinstated. For more than 2 decades, the OTA provided relevant, unbiased, and technical and scientific assessments for members of Congress and their staff. And although the OTA remains authorized to this day, foolishly, the office was defunded in 1995, stripping Congress of a valuable resource that understood emerging technologies as well as the intricacies of the legislative process and the needs of policymakers. The expertise provided by the OTA saved taxpayers billions of dollars by identifying cost-effective areas for future investment and avoiding wasting money on technologies and policies that did not and could not work. The OTA's 24-year body of work encompasses some 750 reports and assessments on issues as far-ranging as arms control to bioterrorism to computer network and security and privacy issues. Interestingly, the last report the OTA issued was on network security and privacy issues, and it was published in 1995, just before it was defunded. Imagine how useful such a report would have been if it could have been paid attention to and updated through today. As technology continues to advance and non-defense budgets continue to shrink, this sort of trustworthy, nonpartisan analysis is no less necessary today than it was when the OTA was first started over 40 years ago. We cannot slow down the rapid pace of technology, but we can give ourselves back an important and proven tool. Congress needs the OTA now more than ever, and what we should be talking about is this, rather than other things we're discussing today. If we really want to get ahead of the next cybersecurity threats, we should be doing everything we can to make informed policy decisions. Instead of straining the authority and the resources of NIST, just so this committee can claim that we did something relevant about cybersecurity, we should be making smart policy with input from nonpartisan experts. This is exactly what the Office of Technology Assessment used to do. And I'm very grateful to my colleague on the committee, Mr. Takano, for his efforts in this area and for co-sponsoring this amendment, as well as to my colleague, Mr. Chaffetz of Utah, who has worked with me for several years advocating for the OTA. And I'd now like to yield 1 minute to my co-sponsor, Mr. Takano.
Thank you, Mr. Foster. I've been proud to work with you in raising awareness and support for the Office of Technology Assessment, or OTA. As you say, for more than 2 decades, OTA provided unbiased technical and scientific assessments for members of Congress and staff. The OTA was defunded in 1995, stripping Congress of a valuable resource. 20 years later, many of the topics OTA studied are still relevant today. I certainly believe that we would be better able to tackle the complexity of an issue like cybersecurity if we had OTA today. This amendment expresses the sense of Congress that OTA should be funded. In a world of alternative facts, the unbiased and thorough analysis of OTA provided, that the OTA provided, is more important than ever. I yield back, Mr. Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Tagano. Mr. Chair, I understand that we are unlikely to have the votes to prevail against your technical point of order against this amendment, and so I hereby withdraw my amendment, but I do urge my colleagues to think critically about the time and money that we could have saved rather than legislating for an uncertain and poorly understood future of technology, and urge my colleagues to work every way we can to try to restore funding for the OTA. Thank you. I feel bad.
Mr. Foster, Mr. Takano, thank you for your comments. As tempted as I am to support an amendment that would allow the President to appoint more individuals, I nevertheless appreciate the gentleman withdrawing the amendment. Without objection, it is withdrawn. Are there any further amendments? If not, a reporting quorum being present, I move that the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology report H.R. 1224 to the House as amended with the recommendation that the bill be approved. The
Mr.
question is
Chairman.
on favorably reporting H.R. 1224 to the House as amended. All those in favor say aye. Opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered reported
Mr.
favorably.
Chairman.
The gentlewoman from Texas.
I'd like to request a record vote on this.
A roll call vote has been requested without objection. Let's see. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Smith.
Aye.
Mr. Smith votes aye. Mr. Lucas. Mr. Lucas votes aye. Mr. Rohrabacher. Mr. Rohrabacher votes aye. Mr. Brooks. Mr. Brooks votes aye. Mr. Holtgren. Mr. Holtgren votes aye. Mr. Posey. Mr. Posey votes aye. Mr. Massey. Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Bridenstine. Mr. Weber. Mr. Weber votes aye. Mr. Knight. Mr. Knight votes aye. Mr. Babin. Mrs. Comstock.
Aye.
Mrs. Comstock votes aye. Mr. Palmer. Mr. Loudermilk. Mr. Abraham. Mr. Abraham votes aye. Mr. LaHood. Mr. LaHood votes aye. Mr. Webster. Mr. Banks. Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Biggs. Mr. Marshall. Mr. Marshall votes aye. Mr. Dunn. Mr. Dunn votes aye. Mr. Higgins. Mr. Higgins votes aye. Ms. Johnson.
No.
Ms. Johnson votes no. Ms. Lofgren. Mr. Lipinski. Mr. Lipinski votes aye. Ms. Bonamici. Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Barra. Mr. Barra votes no. Ms. Esty. Ms. Esty votes no. Mr. Vesey. Mr. Vesey votes no. Mr. Byer. Mr. Byer votes no. Ms. Rosen. Ms. Rosen votes no. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes no. Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter votes no. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes no. Mr. Foster. Mr. Foster votes no. Mr. Takano. Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Hanabusa. Ms. Hanabusa votes no. Mr. Christ. Mr. Christ votes no. Mr. Babin. Mr. Babin votes aye. Mr. Loudermilk. Mr. Loudermilk votes aye.
Okay, let me wait a minute. Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, 19 members voted aye, 14 members voted no.
Okay, the ayes have it, and H.R. 1224 is reported favorably to the House as amended. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. H.R. 1224 is ordered reported to the House. I ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make any necessary technical and conforming changes. Without objection, so ordered. If there is no further discussion, that completes our business, and this concludes the Science Committee markup. With that objection, the committee stands adjourned.